Okay, so the book of Ruth is a short book, by far the shortest book we've read so far. Actually, so far we've been reading a lot of the longer books in the Old Testament. I mean, it's one of the shortest books total. There's not too many books that are shorter than Ruth in the entire Bible. A few, but not many. So it's a short one. We'll be able to get through it, hopefully, in this afternoon. It is also set in the time of the Judges. So Ruth, it was just like the last two. Now, this is not... Okay, so I've said before about my general preferences in reading the Bible is to read these books sort of in the order in which the events happened, and kind of a mixture between that and the event order in which they were written. It's hard to say when Ruth was written. The story itself takes place in the time of the Judges. So this story fits in very naturally here in this spot after Judges because it takes place in this time. It's the only book in the Bible, except for Judges, that takes place in the time of the Judges. And it fits in with the stories, Judges itself ends with these two separate stories that talk about things that happened in the land during the time of Judges that don't actually involve a judge, per se. And so Ruth does kind of fit in naturally reading that after the book of Judges for that reason, too. It bridges the gap between Judges and Samuel, where Samuel comes along as the last judge and anoints the first king, actually the first two kings, Saul and David. So it is a nice little bridge there. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, Ruth does not occur in the same spot where it does in these Bibles, which we have. Most English Bibles would have the order of the books arranged in such a way that Ruth occurs here after Judges. Hebrew Bibles actually put it in the wisdom section of the book between Proverbs and Song of Solomon. Of course, Proverbs ends, the last chapter of Proverbs ends with this description of this ideal woman. It's like who is the ideal woman, like the wife of noble character or whatever it's called. Then you go right on to that into Ruth, who pretty much is that woman, like pretty much is an example of that woman. And you go from there to the Song of Solomon, which is all about the intimacy of the marriage bed. So there's a reason for putting it there too. But historically, in terms of understanding the progress of time, it makes sense to read Judges now. I don't know exactly when I don't know when exactly Ruth would have been written. There's a tradition, the ancient Jewish tradition, that Samuel wrote Ruth, which is possible. Samuel certainly would have been in a position to know about this story and may have written it down in some form or fashion. Now, clearly it was written after, the finalized version that we have makes a reference to the exile near the end? And so anyway, it was written at some point. The final version of Ruth that we have probably was written well after the days of Samuel. He could have been responsible for writing down an early version of it that was then later finished by some other copyist. We're entering that part. Judges actually is kind of the first of these. We're entering that section in the Bible where it becomes impossible to tell who actually wrote what. There's a number of books here in the history section of our Bibles, as we have them arranged in our arrangement, where it's just impossible to say who actually was responsible for writing what parts of this. Judges is kind of the first of those. I mean, even with Joshua, we can't really be certain who wrote that down, but it was clearly somebody who was familiar with what was going on, either Joshua himself or Phinehas, the priest who was with him, or somebody who was right there, and then maybe edited slightly later. With Judges and Ruth and then Samuel and Kings, it's just not possible to be certain about that, because especially when we get to the Kings, like it couldn't have been written by any one person. This would have been compiled from written sources that would have been documented over a long period of time. And so it's possible that Samuel did write something that became the basis of what we now have as the book of Ruth. We just honestly don't know. The book of Ruth takes place during the time of the Judges. It's hard to say exactly when. We have some genealogies in Ruth, which could help us form a rough timeline of when we have David's genealogy at the end of the book of Ruth. So if we count back the generations from David, we could get a rough idea of when this story takes place. The problem with that is that we don't know if that genealogy is complete. It may be, but it may not be. So we just don't really know. So we have Boaz's genealogy. Boaz is the husband, the guy who will marry Ruth, and so we can work backwards from David to get to Boaz, or we can work from Boaz backwards to some other generation before that, and find out when they came into the land when Boaz lived. Either way, though, these genealogies aren't always complete, so it's going to be hard to determine a timeline based on that, because we just don't know if we have all the names we need in order to know for certain how many years roughly may have passed. So we just don't really know. We could think of this taking place roughly around 1200 BC. David's going to come along in about 1000 BC, right about actually he'll be born before that, but he's at his height right around 1000 BC, and this is at least 100 plus years before that, assuming the genealogy at the end of the book is complete. It may not be. So 1100 to 1200 BC sounds like it's a reasonable time frame somewhere in there for this story. It's a short book. It only takes place over 4 chapters. It's a story. It's a narrative. It does, however, have a lot of technical information in it that shows a lot about Israelite life at this point in time. We're going to see some examples in play here that we don't really read about in other books of the Bible, but that were part of Israelite life that we only really get, clear examples of here in the book of Ruth. We're going to get the concept of the law in action, actually, as we try to settle a dispute about land and about inheritances and things like that through marriage. Marrying off a widow to somebody. You can't do that. Go away. As we try to solve a problem of a widow who has no one to carry on her husband's inheritance by marrying somebody, and we'll get to that. So there's a lot of legalities and technicalities here. It's a short story. It's easy to read. But there's a lot of technicalities here that go into some pretty deep minutiae of how the law actually works. Before I get started, also, the book is named after Ruth, but Ruth is probably, honestly, not the main character of this book. The actual main character of this book is probably Naomi, the older lady that Ruth follows around. Now, Ruth ends up being the solution. Well, not really. Boaz ends up being the solution, but Ruth. So Naomi. The problem in the book is Naomi. Like I say, Naomi is the main character in the sense that Naomi is the character who has a problem. The book starts off explaining how Naomi got into her problem, and then it ends with her problem being solved. Okay, so it's like Naomi is the character who actually goes through what we, with our Western history and way of looking at literature, would consider to be the main character, because she's the one who starts off in a place, has a problem, goes through a predicament, has to deal with that issue, has to resolve that problem. Kat, I don't like the way you're just kind of hovering around here. You're really bothering me. And then ends up having her problem solved and is restored to her original position. Ruth doesn't go through any of that. Like Ruth doesn't go through all. So in our way of thinking of, she is like right here. I mean, I'm sorry if I seem distracted right now, because I am. I mean, I want you to move, Kat. Like, I just don't like you being here right next to this camera. And your tail wagging around, makes me very nervous. Anyway, so Ruth ends up basically being the vehicle through which Naomi solves her problem. So I don't know how they name these books, honestly. If I were in charge of naming these books, I probably would not have named this book after Ruth, in the sense that Ruth would not be the main character by my definition of the main character. Our definition of main character is based on the Western tradition. It would actually be Naomi, not Ruth. Ruth is like the example of the virtuous woman here, though. It's like she is being portrayed here as like the ideal woman, like the ideal wife. So she probably gets the title for that reason. Like here is, and again, like I said, in the Jewish Bibles, this book comes in between Proverbs and Song of Solomon. So she bridges the gap between the Proverbs 31 woman and then the bride of Song of Solomon. So she is an example of like this ideal woman. Like here is what you're looking for in a wife, basically. So that's probably why the book is named after her. But in our concept of understanding like who goes through the development, who goes through the journey, this book is actually about Naomi, who has the problem that needs to be solved, and Ruth ends up just being the vehicle through which that. Boaz actually provides, but he's the guy. He actually provides a solution to the problem, but Ruth is the vehicle by which Naomi gets that solution. So anyway, so keep that in mind. Let's go ahead and start a new video.